Imagine standing alone in a dimly lit room, the walls pressing in like silent witnesses, and someone whose approval you once craved, is staring at you, waiting. You feel your heartbeat thundering in your chest as words scramble to form in your mouth. I didn't mean it that way. You begin, and instantly the tremor of regret hits. The words meant to clarify, to defend, to illuminate your intentions seem hollow. They float in the air, unanchored, vulnerable. And yet, you feel compelled to speak, as if the very act of explanation could shield you from judgment, misunderstanding, or abandonment. But here lies the unsettling truth. Every explanation is a surrender, a subtle admission that your existence, your choices, yourself, require validation. The urge to explain is one of the most insidious traps of human consciousness. It whispers that if only others understood the labyrinth of your mind, the complexity of your motives, they would finally cease their criticism. Yet, paradoxically, the more we unravel ourselves, the more we expose ourselves to scrutiny. Every attempt at clarity becomes a double-edged sword. The moment you articulate your reasoning, you open doors to questions you never anticipated, challenges you cannot preempt. In striving to justify, we often dig a deeper trench of self-doubt and defensiveness. As Carl Jung once observed, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And in this pursuit, constant explanation is the antithesis of authenticity. It is an externalization of our inner fear, a concession that our being alone is insufficient, that the mere act of existing is not enough to command respect. Consider the social theater that surrounds us. Colleagues, friends, family, even strangers online. Each interaction is a potential arena for misunderstanding. When we explain ourselves, we give others the script of our psyche, yet they may read only what confirms their biases. The mind is a prism, refracting every word according to its own angles, and no explanation can control that distortion. Friedrich Nietzsche warned of this danger, noting, "He who cannot obey himself will be commanded." In the context of human relationships, over-explaining becomes a form of self-subjugation. We obey the imagined judgments of others rather than trust in our own integrity. Moreover, explanations often stem from a deeper psychological wound, the belief that our intrinsic worth is contingent on comprehension by others. We forget that understanding is neither owed nor guaranteed. The most profound experiences, grief, love, moral conviction, often resist translation into language. To explain them fully is to dilute their essence. Arthur Schopenhauer encapsulated this in his observation: "Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world." When we attempt to justify ourselves, we unconsciously impose the narrow spectrum of our own understanding onto others, as if they should naturally conform to the same mental map. There is a quiet liberation in realizing that not all judgment requires response, that the silence of unspoken rationale can be a fortress rather than a prison. Imagine the relief of no longer being tethered to the relentless need to justify every thought, every choice. Yet, embracing this liberation demands courage, a radical acceptance of vulnerability. It asks us to trust that our essence, our actions, our presence, our moral compass, does not require external validation to exist meaningfully. As we step closer to this understanding, a tension arises, the tension between human desire for recognition and the equally human capacity for autonomy. And it is in this tension that the deeper philosophical and psychological implications of withholding explanation begin to crystallize. What follows is not merely a tactical choice in conversation. It is a transformative shift in how we relate to ourselves and the world around us. The act of silence becomes a testament to self-possession, a quiet rebellion against the tyranny of perpetual justification. Picture this: you have done something, an act born from instinct, conviction, or necessity, and the world immediately questions it. A friend raises an eyebrow. A colleague murmurs disapproval. The moment is charged with silent interrogation, a subtle accusation that you are somehow deficient unless your reasoning is made transparent. Your mind races, your voice trembles, and before you know it, you are offering justifications, narrating the meticulous architecture of your choices as if that alone could shield you from scrutiny. Yet, what if the very act of explaining is the trap itself? Psychologically, the need to explain is rooted in a fragile self-concept, the belief that our identity must be constantly corroborated externally. Viktor Frankl, who endured the unspeakable horrors of concentration camps, insisted that the last of human freedoms is the choice of one's attitude. Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. Explanation often collapses that space, forcing us to react defensively to external perceptions rather than exercise the quiet autonomy of our inner judgment. By offering reasons for our actions, we hand over that sacred space, relinquishing our authority to the interpretations and biases of others. Socially, the act of explaining is an unstable bridge. Communication is never a neutral transmission. It is filtered through the subjective lens of the listener, shaped by their preconceptions, anxieties, and desires. You may spend hours articulating your motives with precision, yet all your efforts can be refracted into misunderstanding or criticism. Jean-Paul Sartre encapsulated this human predicament in his existential philosophy. Man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. In a society that constantly evaluates and judges, explanations feel necessary, yet they bind us to the judgment of others, forcing freedom into conformity. Moreover, explanations can become weapons turned against us. Each word, each rationale, leaves a trace, a potential opening for counterarguments. Imagine confessing the logic behind a choice to a skeptic. Your careful reasoning is dissected, your motives interrogated, and suddenly, the clarity you sought transforms into vulnerability. The mind, in seeking approval, inadvertently constructs a cage of its own making. Aldous Huxley once noted, "Experience is not what happens to a man. It is what a man does with what happens to him." Here, the wisdom is stark. The value of an act, a thought, or a principle is not measured by its reception but by the integrity of its execution. Explanation, in its eagerness to translate the internal into the external, risks eroding that integrity. There is also a subtle psychological dynamic at play. The compulsion to explain often arises from fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood. And yet, this fear is often exaggerated by the very act of over-justifying. Each explanation signals, consciously or unconsciously, that your worth hinges on the listener's approval. Your authenticity becomes hostage to perception, your inner certainty subverted by external expectation. The mind, in its attempt to assert itself, becomes entangled in an endless cycle of rationalization and doubt, feeding anxiety rather than quelling it. Ultimately, the act of explaining oneself exposes a profound paradox. The more we seek understanding from others, the less we trust ourselves. In surrendering our judgment to the perception of others, we reinforce the illusion that validation is external rather than internal. This is not arrogance, nor is it cynicism. It is a disciplined acknowledgement that our essence, our reasoning, and our moral compass are sufficient without constant external corroboration. To break free from the trap of justification requires a radical act of self-possession. To recognize that the world may never fully understand, yet the measure of your life is contained not in their comprehension but in your own fidelity to yourself. Imagine sitting across from someone whose opinion you once held in reverence, the conversation drifting toward an incident from your past. Instinctively, you begin to justify layer upon layer, weaving explanations like a protective net. But instead of relief, you sense tension tightening. The person's eyes flicker, not with understanding, but with scrutiny, impatience, or even subtle judgment. You realize too late that every explanation you offered, every rationalization, did not create connection. It built distance. In the pursuit of comprehension, you have unwittingly sown alienation. Over-explaining carries the paradoxical effect of eroding trust rather than fostering it. Relationships thrive on authenticity, on the silent acknowledgement that individuals are complex and self-contained. When we feel compelled to justify ourselves constantly, we signal doubt in our own integrity. This insecurity is contagious. It invites skepticism from others, subtly implying that our actions require external endorsement. Viktor Frankl's reflections on human resilience resonate here. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. The challenge is profound. The compulsion to explain is not merely a social habit. It is a psychological hurdle that undermines the very relational and personal stability we seek. In practical terms, consider professional environments. A leader who constantly justifies decisions communicates indecision and lack of confidence. A colleague who over-explains their choices may inadvertently encourage micromanagement or criticism. Socially, over-explaining can be equally corrosive. People naturally respond to confidence and decisiveness. Explanations, especially excessive ones, can be interpreted as defensiveness, insecurity, or even a plea for validation. Jean-Paul Sartre's existential insight that existence precedes essence illuminates this tension. The value of a person's actions lies not in the explanations offered, but in the intentionality and authenticity of the act itself. Over-explaining conflates essence with perception, making the self contingent upon the approval of others. Emotionally, over-explaining exacts a hidden toll. Each explanation requires mental energy, each defense demands emotional labor, and each justification reinforces self-consciousness. The mind becomes a theater of constant rehearsals, anticipating questions, rationalizing motives, crafting responses. Arthur Schopenhauer warned against this self-imposed tyranny. Compassion is the basis of morality. The subtle moral lesson here is that self-compassion, an unyielding trust in one's own reasoning and morality, is more sustaining than the hollow quest for external approval. Over-explaining erodes that trust, replacing self-assurance with the anxiety of perpetual interpretation. Furthermore, explanations often invite debate where none is needed. The human mind, conditioned to analyze and critique, rarely leaves an explanation unchallenged. Each defense opens the door to further inquiry, criticism, or even misrepresentation. The very act intended to clarify can spiral into conflict, creating emotional fatigue and relational strain. Aldous Huxley observed, "Words can be like X-rays if you use them properly. They'll go through anything. You read and you're pierced." Every word we use to justify ourselves is a fragile X-ray, exposing inner truths not meant for scrutiny, vulnerable to being misread or weaponized. The relational consequences are subtle but profound. Friends and colleagues may begin to see you as insecure, indecisive, or defensive. Your authority diminishes not because of what you did, but because of how you responded. Ironically, the more we attempt to protect ourselves through explanation, the more we reveal the fragility we sought to conceal. This underscores a critical psychological truth. Connection is strengthened not by exhaustive justification, but by presence, integrity, and the quiet confidence that one's actions are coherent without need for constant defense. Picture standing at a crossroads of judgment and autonomy, where every instinct urges you to explain, defend, and justify, yet a quiet voice whispers, "What if none of it is necessary?" Imagine the tension dissolving, not because the world finally understands, but because you have chosen to release the need for understanding. There is a radical, almost defiant freedom in withholding explanation. A freedom that asserts, without arrogance, that your existence, your choices, and your values do not require constant validation. This liberation is not mere defiance. It is the conscious exercise of self-possession. When we refrain from explaining ourselves, we reclaim the authority over our own narratives. We no longer allow the imagined judgments of others to dictate our inner equilibrium. Carl Jung's insight illuminates this path. The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it. By withholding explanation, we invest meaning internally, trusting that our moral compass and our judgment are sufficient, independent of external interpretation. The act of silence becomes a vessel for self-respect, a declaration that our authenticity cannot be negotiated. There is also a psychological alchemy in this restraint. Each word we speak carries energy. Each justification expends emotional and cognitive resources. By choosing silence, we conserve that energy, redirecting it toward thought, reflection, and action. Viktor Frankl suggested that meaning arises not from the approval of others, but from our response to life's challenges. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Withholding explanation is precisely this choice, an assertion of sovereignty over our emotional and intellectual life, a declaration that we will not be imprisoned by the need to convince others. The social impact of this choice is equally profound. Ironically, those who attempt to control us through judgment often lose their power when we cease to explain. Silence does not provoke misunderstanding in the usual sense. It projects stability, confidence, and self-reliance. Relationships are no longer tethered to the precarious scaffolding of our justifications. Instead, they operate in the realm of mutual respect, where each individual bears responsibility for interpreting others' actions without coercion. Friedrich Nietzsche observed, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." In this context, our why, the integrity of our choices and the authenticity of our selfhood, is sufficient to navigate the how of others' perceptions. Yet, embracing this liberation is neither easy nor universally accepted. Society conditions us to provide rationales, to translate our inner experiences into digestible explanations. The instinct to justify is ingrained from childhood. We explain ourselves to parents, teachers, peers, and eventually to colleagues, partners, and strangers. Breaking free requires conscious courage, a willingness to risk disapproval and even conflict in the service of inner coherence. Jean-Paul Sartre's existential call resonates here. Freedom is what you do with what's been done to you. The freedom of withholding explanations is an active, deliberate stance, a refusal to subordinate our inner life to the whims of external interpretation. Importantly, this liberation does not imply withdrawal or detachment. It does not excuse cruelty, dishonesty, or negligence. Rather, it signifies a disciplined trust in the sufficiency of one's own moral and intellectual compass. By choosing when and to whom we offer explanation, we exercise discernment, preserving our integrity while maintaining authentic connection. Silence, in this sense, is not absence. It is presence at its most potent, a quiet assertion of selfhood that resonates far deeper than the transient approval of others ever could. Imagine waking each day with the awareness that your life's worth does not depend on validation from others. This is not an abstract aspiration. It is a disciplined practice, a conscious cultivation of self-possession. The ability to resist the urge to explain oneself requires mental fortitude, emotional resilience, and philosophical clarity. It is, in essence, an art of living that challenges the deepest instincts of insecurity and social conformity. The first strategy is developing internal authority. Viktor Frankl emphasized the necessity of self-directed meaning. Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. When confronted with judgment or misunderstanding, pause before speaking. Ask yourself, is this explanation necessary for clarity, or am I unconsciously seeking approval? By distinguishing between necessity and compulsion, you reclaim the power to choose your response, rather than reflexively submitting to external pressure. This internal questioning is a muscle. It strengthens with practice, becoming second nature over time. Another critical strategy is embracing selective transparency. Not all silence is defiance, and not all explanation is weakness. The key is intentionality. Share your reasoning when it serves clarity, growth, or accountability, but resist the compulsion to justify out of fear, insecurity, or a need for validation. Aldous Huxley observed, "Experience is not what happens to a man. It is what a man does with what happens to him." Here, experience becomes actionable. We discern when words enrich understanding and when they merely drain energy. Intentionality transforms silence from passivity into an instrument of psychological integrity. Equally important is cultivating a tolerance for discomfort. Withholding explanation will inevitably provoke impatience, skepticism, and at times, hostility from others. The mind may rebel, conjuring scenarios in which misunderstanding erodes relationships or status. Yet, this tension is essential to growth. Jean-Paul Sartre's existential insight, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself," reminds us that freedom entails responsibility and, often, solitude. Enduring the discomfort of not explaining fosters resilience, deepens self-trust, and diminishes dependence on external approval. Practices such as journaling and reflection can reinforce this discipline. Writing thoughts privately without the need for audience validation trains the mind to organize reasoning internally rather than externally. Meditation and contemplative silence also anchor one's awareness in presence rather than perception, cultivating a calm center resistant to judgment. Carl Jung's reflections on individuation are relevant here. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. By integrating experience internally, we reduce the urge to defend or rationalize externally. Finally, it is essential to recognize the existential payoff. The liberation of withholding explanations extends beyond personal efficiency or social advantage. It reshapes our experience of reality. When your self-worth is anchored internally, you navigate relationships, work, and public life with clarity, confidence, and moral coherence. Over time, others respond not to the defenses you offer but to the quiet authority you project. Arthur Schopenhauer aptly noted, "Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world." By withholding explanation, we invite others to engage with us without distortion, while simultaneously expanding our own perception of freedom and integrity. Through these strategies, internal authority, selective transparency, tolerance of discomfort, reflective practice, and existential alignment, we cultivate a life where explanation is optional, not compulsory. Each choice to remain silent, each refusal to justify, is an assertion of sovereignty, a profound act of self-respect. And as this discipline deepens, a radical transformation occurs. The mind, once enslaved to judgment, becomes a sanctuary of freedom, confidence, and authentic presence. Imagine standing alone on a cliff's edge at twilight, the wind whipping around you, and sensing that the world below will never fully grasp your reasoning, your choices, or your inner life. The instinct to explain screams within, demanding that your intentions be understood, your actions justified. Yet you remain silent. In this silence, a paradox emerges. You feel lighter, freer, as if the weight of perpetual judgment has been lifted. The liberation is intoxicating, not because the world finally understands, but because you have ceased to tether your essence to their perception. The ultimate consequence of withholding explanation is psychological sovereignty. Over years, even decades, this discipline transforms the relationship you have with your own mind. Anxiety diminishes, not because the world is less judgmental, but because your inner world is no longer hostage to external approval. Viktor Frankl's reflections echo here. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. By refusing to explain, we exercise the ultimate form of freedom. We choose our response, our value system, and our self-respect, independent of others' comprehension. The mind, once restless and reactive, becomes a fortress of equanimity and clarity. Relationally, this stance produces subtle but profound effects. Silence carries authority in ways that words cannot. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers sense a confidence that does not demand validation, a quiet integrity that cannot be manipulated or undermined. Over time, interactions are governed less by negotiation of perception and more by genuine engagement with your presence and actions. Friedrich Nietzsche observed, "Invisible threads are the strongest ties." In withholding explanation, we forge relationships based on authentic resonance rather than the fragile scaffolding of justification. Existentially, refusing to explain oneself is a radical affirmation of being. Jean-Paul Sartre's insight, "Man is condemned to be free," illuminates the gravity of this choice. To live fully, one must claim responsibility for one's existence without deference to the arbitrary judgments of others. By remaining silent, you assert that your essence is complete, coherent, and self-sufficient. Life is no longer an endless negotiation for understanding. It becomes a space where authenticity and integrity guide every action. The existential tension of freedom, of living under the gaze of others yet independent of their verdicts, is transformed into a source of vitality rather than anxiety. There is, too, a profound moral dimension. When we stop explaining ourselves, we stop performing moral accounting for those incapable of understanding. We stop diluting our principles to appease skepticism. Arthur Schopenhauer's reflections on morality are illuminating. Compassion is the basis of morality. By trusting our own moral compass rather than defending it to an external audience, we act from integrity rather than from fear, and our deeds resonate with genuine ethical clarity. Each action becomes an authentic expression of self, untainted by the compulsion to justify. Finally, the spiritual and existential resonance is undeniable. To live without the constant need for explanation is to inhabit a life where presence, action, and authenticity are inseparable. Carl Jung's assertion, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are," reaches its fullest expression here. The refusal to explain oneself is not arrogance, nor is it retreat. It is the ultimate reconciliation with one's own being. It is an act of courage, a declaration that your essence, your decisions, and your existence are inherently meaningful, independent of recognition or validation. In the end, the refusal to explain is more than a strategy. It is a philosophy, a psychological practice, and a radical affirmation of freedom. It frees the mind, strengthens relationships, and cultivates a life of integrity and authenticity. Silence, in this sense, is not absence. It is the ultimate presence, the confident, unassailable presence of a self that is whole, grounded, and unbound by the expectations of the world.